Eh, Primero quiero agradecer a Eva y el Instituto del Teatro y la Embajada de Holanda para facilitar mi presencia aquí. Voy a hablar en inglés, lo siento, porque bueno, aunque hablo castellano, no me viene muy fácil. Parece mentira, pero lo es. Y bueno, entonces voy a seguir también para dar un poco de trabajo a las compañeras en inglés. Sigo un poco más en español. Es que 45 minutos para esta charla es muy corto. Estoy enseñando un curso a la Universidad de Utrecht de 10 semanas. Y esto es muy corto, entonces no sé cómo voy a llegar a decir todo lo que quiero decir en este horita. Pero vamos a tratarlo. Y también quiero felicitar al Instituto con la llegada de un programa oficial en arte comunitario, porque es algo fabuloso, es algo que en Holanda todavía no tenemos. El curso que yo enseño es el único curso en Holanda al nivel universitario, solamente ocurre una vez por año, 10 semanas. Aunque pasen estudiantes que hacen su maestría conmigo, son muy pocos, 4 o 5 por año a lo máximo. Al nivel de enseñanza profesional de artistas, todavía no existe una manera de formarse como artista comunitaria, para decirlo así. Bueno, y ahora de verdad voy a seguir en inglés. Voy a tratar de hablar muy lentamente y tampoco leer demasiado, pero a veces necesito mis papeles para no perderme. Okay. The presentation you saw earlier from England already gave you another perspective, expanding the frame of reference. And I think it's very important, also listening to what all of you had to say yesterday, it's very important to establish a frame of reference and to keep on expanding that frame of reference, because the world of what we call in the Netherlands community arts, but which in other places may be a loaded term. In England or the UK, they prefer the term participatory arts. In the United States, they use community-based arts to distinguish it from amateur arts practices. So wherever you look in the world, and this world of community arts, let's use the term community arts just for the sake of being able to communicate for now. So wherever you go, people have different ways of defining it, different ways of looking at it, different frames of references. And what I hope this morning to offer you is a slightly expanded frame of reference with my frame of reference entering this space and thereby expanding all of our frame of reference, which will then also change the conversation we have about this work. My first expansion of the frame of reference. I want to take you to what I consider one of the most extraordinary examples of arts for social inclusion, community arts. It's an annual parade in Brussels called the Escénicas parade. Imagine, it happens once every 2 years. There is a local city office that organizes it. They have a small budget. They offer any neighborhood who wants to participate a small subsidy of 1,500 euros, not much, with which the neighborhood residents hire an artist, and then they create an element, a performative element, that will be included in this parade. That's enough as a background. I'll show you a quick video which should give you an impression of what the Escénicas parade is. I should have explained that every Zinneke parade has a theme. This last year, May 2012, the theme was recycling and natural energy, as you could see. So that's sort of like a guideline. And it has a principle. Anyone, regardless of race, class, religion, social background, ability or disability, can join. I find that also an extraordinary event. It has inspired us in Utrecht, my hometown, to do something similar. The opening slide was an image of an annual tradition that we have. It's called the St. Martin celebration. St. Martin happens to be the patron saint of Utrecht, and we've started to do something similar, organize neighborhood-based parades that end up downtown. Another example to expand our frame of reference. At our last festival, I direct a festival in Rotterdam called the International Community Arts Festival. We had organized so-called artists in residencies, and we had led a group of young people from Rotterdam with a Portuguese-speaking background, many of them coming from the Cape Verde Islands or their parents, worked together with a group from Rio de Janeiro called Favela Força, which is based in a favela, a slum area called Vila Cruzeiro. Let's expand our frame of reference a little bit more. This is a quick clip, gives you an impression of what this was like. There were video artists involved. The Favela Força specializes in musical theater and movement, and the group of youngsters we work with specializes more in theater, straight theater or hip-hop and urban culture stuff. And they blended beautifully together and also exchanged experiences about how they work and why they do it. This project, and particularly Favela Força, introduces another principle, I think, of arts for social inclusion, and that is that the importance of expressing your own story on your own terms, rather than letting other people do that for you. Oops, there you go. I will distribute these slides. I've sent copies of these slides to Eva, and they can be distributed to you, so in case you want to take notes. So this introduces a second principle, I think, the importance of telling your own story on your own terms, rather than letting others create them for you because then you run the risk of emphasizing and enhancing stigmas about the so-called other. A third expansion of our frame of reference is this project, which happened also a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago. A group of Moluccans, I don't know if you know where the Moluccan Islands are, it's a group of islands in Indonesia. Many Moluccans came to the Netherlands after World War II when Indonesia became independent, and they ended up, because after World War II there was a lack of public housing in our country, they ended up being placed and lodged in a former concentration camp, German concentration camp, Camp Westerbork. And in November 2011, some of the oldest people who came over in the 1950s were part of this performance in which for the first time they told their story on their own terms, supported by a professional theater crew on site in this concentration camp. So this should begin to give you an idea about what I mean with performing arts and social inclusion. People who normally do not actively engage in the arts, working together with professional artists to express something they find important in high-quality performances. In this way, underrepresented perspectives also begin to become part of what you could call a national conversation, or even the cultural canon. My perspective, as I speak here, is not neutral. No one's perspective is. I was born in 1955, 10 years after World War II, in a rural village on the Belgian border. That is the Catholic part of the country, which was occupied in the 16th and 17th century by the Spanish. Things change. It's also a place where Carnival is being celebrated annually, very fanatically, I can tell you, in the weekend or the weeks before Ash Wednesday. And this is one of the most socially inclusive and oldest cultural practices in the Netherlands. There's a picture there coming. Entire villages get in on the act, working in secret on floats and gags, like the one you see here about the recent Pope, between October and February. Folk culture like this is also an important root of art for social inclusion. And the Scottish anthropologist Victor Turner says that better than anyone else that I know. Let me read that to you. In this important book, From Ritual to Theatre, The Human Seriousness of Play, he states, art presses meaning out of our lives. It helps us to interpret past and present and try out scenarios for the future. Victor Turner calls this the exploring antennae by which we move forward. Antennae are these things that insects have on their heads with which they detect where they have to go. Every person has the right to express his or her humanity on his or her own terms. Community art enables more people than ever before to do so. Art is a human right. And that is one of the best arguments that I can formulate for the work that we do and that we find so important. At age 9, my family and I moved to Utrecht in the north, when my father had found a job in the National Printers Union as an office worker. This move in 1964 was part of many different moves from various parts of the country, all to the center. And also, just a few years later, more or less simultaneously, external migration were added on to these internal migrations. I feel I have to do this a little bit for you also to get an idea of what happened in my country and how my country today in 2013 is based on all these different kinds of migrations that affect the people and the contexts in which we do this kind of work. You may know that the Netherlands also was a colonial power for several centuries. And after World War II, roughly as a decolonization process went underway, also from former colonies, former Dutch colonies, people started coming from Indonesia, from Suriname, from the Antilles, and later from countries like Morocco and Turkey, and from Spain, Greece, Italy. And that migration process is actually being repeated as I speak. Particularly young people from your country, from Greece, Portugal, Italy, moving to Northern Europe to find jobs. And there too, there are fewer and fewer jobs. Let me take a sip. Okay, my eyes are getting tired. Time to put on my glasses. All right. Stories of migration, diasporas of many kind, and cultural diversity figure prominently in my tale. Moving from the south to the north, up the social ladder, working abroad for 12 years, returning home, marrying a woman from the Caribbean, having a child with her, it all affects the work that I do and gives me first-hand knowledge of what some no longer call multiculturalism or interculturalism, but superdiversity. Superdiversity is an interesting term, I think. Let me explain it briefly, just to add to the already confusing mix of terms that we have. Superdiversity, very simply put, is a new term that a Dutch scholar, Jan Brommaert, coined to explain that migration patterns are no longer what they used to be. In the old days, in the 50s, 60s, people would come from Morocco to Holland and stay there. But later, particularly with the advent of new technology, like mobile phones, smartphones, social media, and other reasons for migration, people move on. They move from country A to country B, move on to country C, to country D, sometimes come back to C. So all of these things have become much more complicated. And that's why he has coined this, I think, very interesting and useful term called super diversity. It also affects our work. We see it, for instance, in a project we did just a few years ago, which was revived just on International Women's Day on the 8th of March, a couple of weeks ago, with the Somali community. The Somali community that came from Somalia to the Netherlands is one of the most super diverse migratory groups you can imagine. They tend to come from Somalia to Western Europe, to the Netherlands, move on to England, and then some move on to Canada, the United States, come back. There are all kinds of very fascinating patterns. And I just want to show you a brief clip of a show we made with 4 women.
Check it out. Geleerd voor mijn zoon. Oh. Ja, die zit in de middelbare school. Gisteren, hij kwam naar mij toe. Hij zei, ma, er is een disco vanavond op school. Ik zeg, zorg dat hij goed gekleed gaat. Hij zei, hoor je me niet? Er is een disco vanavond op school. Ik zeg, het is toch van school? Ga maar. Even later, hij ging MTV te kijken. Ik zeg, je moet niet kijken, je moet oefenen. Vanavond, disco op school!
Gives you an idea of how super diversity can work in a theater space with these wonderful women. And there's all kinds of stories behind the images I'm showing you, stories that can take another hour to explain each time, so we won't do that. So this is like a, call it a lightning journey through my frame of reference. The voice, as I said, my voice here is not neutral. It's formed by what I have experienced, where I've been. It has been further modulated by a number of other personal experiences. At one point, I was the first in my family to go to university. I still am the first in my family to have gone to university. I ended up getting a scholarship to go to the United States, where I stayed for 8 years. And there I did a PhD on political theater that had emerged in the 1960s and 70s. And that became, I think, also an important root of the work that we do here today. It's the Teatro Popular, if you will, that you also had here in Spain, and that was flourishing all over Western Europe, in the United States, Canada, and other parts of the Western world. And also the company that I work for in the Netherlands, the Rotterdam Neighborhood Theater, as well as another company in Utrecht called Stut, they were all formed and founded by people who emerged from this political theater movement, from this movimiento de teatro popular. So we have explored some roots of community arts, the popular culture roots, folk culture roots. There are important roots here in this field, which I won't dwell on too long either, because that would take me another hour, if not more, to do so. But in general, I think it's pretty obvious that the community arts in which we are involved here today has its roots in these very complicated, long-term, important processes that took place in the 1960s. Revolutionary processes that took place in the Caribbean, various Asian countries, the decolonization processes that took place in Africa, in the Caribbean, and all kinds of emancipation movements that emerged from it in the West. Black power, brown power, red power, women's power, girl power, queer emancipation, you name it. All of it led to a widespread civil rights movement in the West, which in turn also led to ideas about community development. But before I move on to that, there's a couple of grand figures, I think, that helped us in our thinking, in the development of this work. The one on the right, I'm sure you know. The one on the left, I don't necessarily think you know. His name is Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is a Kenyan playwright, novelist. Both of these figures, in a sense, made I think, a revolutionary discovery. And that is that the political theater that I mentioned earlier, which was very much a message-driven theater, created and performed by middle-class artists performing for the down and out and the oppressed at factory gates. These two people discovered more or less simultaneously, one in Brazil and the other in Kenya, that actually it was a much smarter idea to get the people from the auditorium on the stage and let them perform themselves in their own stories. Turning spectators into spect-actors, as Boal is famously known for saying. So the civil rights movement, all these emancipatory movements also led to community development movement, which works much more in the social field. But there too, people living in particular neighborhoods were made or felt they had to take more responsibility for the development of their own environments. And they too, tenant associations, all kinds of organizations, grassroots organizations, started looking for ways to collaborate with artists, like the Greenwich Mural Workshop in London is a famous group, a pioneering group to have been part of this fusion, this merger. Another root of community art, and then we move on, and sooner or later we come to the present day, is, I think, so we've had the political roots, the radical roots, we had the folk cultural roots, and I think another important root that is often sort of overshadowed in this work is the root of the avant-garde, because also in the 60s and 70s there were artists who also had become fed up or very critical of the institutions they worked in, the institutions which they also regarded as anything but neutral institutions. And they started literally to take the painting off the canvas and the theater plays from the stage out into the streets. So artists were constantly looking for inspiration in daily life. And famous artists like Merce Cunningham in the dance world and John Cage in the music world began to see that any movement could be a dance and any sound could be beautiful music. And that principle too, I think, lies at the root of the work that we do. Moving right along. Community art, and I hope I'm not getting too abstract here. Sooner or later we come back to the concrete. Community art obliterates the dichotomy, the division between art for art's sake and art with a purpose, and the status of the individual artist as genius maker of artifacts. The role of the artist in this work has changed from a technically superior object maker to also being a facilitator, organizer, researcher, and entrepreneur. And hence, and I know I'm really taking a big jump here, art criticism, I think. Art criticism that observes, assesses, evaluates this kind of work, the work that all of you do, I think also needs to undergo a paradigm shift. But because lots of art criticism being taught at universities and elsewhere is still very much focused in a conventional way on assessing an object. And I think in terms of art criticism, the paradigm shift that we need to make, as some of my colleagues elsewhere in the world also agree, is that we need to see the whole project, as it were, the whole process involved in the making of this kind of work as the work of art. So we need to also, in that sense, expand our frame of reference, expand our vision. So a new form of art criticism is needed, I think. New scholarship as well. A new scholarship that is able to also capture the magical moments in the processes. That's why I found it so important to document work professionally, to document work very, very well, so we know what happens on the work floor, as our colleagues from the Central School of did previously as well. I think that kind of work is extremely important to document the work, to talk about it, rather than only looking at the end result. Community art, I think, also stretches the notion of that we have about what can and cannot be art. And once you stretch that notion, it can be found anywhere, not only in spaces like this, in institutions like this, but it can be found anywhere, on murals, in choirs, in neighborhood centers. It could be embroidery, it could be DJing, it could be parades like the ones I showed you earlier as well. That, in a nutshell, is the basis, the roots, if you will, of the community or participatory arts that can be found all over the world today as I speak. It's an incredible array of practices, of which I've only shown you the tip of the iceberg, with many inflections and models that range from first voice self-presentation to, like the Hoyo Ma'an piece, the Somali piece I just showed you, to professional performers representing others. And I want to show you one recent example of a project that is still ongoing currently. A partner of ours in Haarlem, the city of Haarlem. It's called Fifth Quarter. Amazing artists that actually have come from the avant-garde scene, much more visually oriented. Just to briefly explain the context, because it's important to explain context when we talk about examples like these. This area, of which you see a picture, is a high-rise post-World War II neighborhood in Haarlem, where there is a park. In this park, all the trees are being cut. And the neighborhood is very pissed about it, very angry about it. And the artists working in this area have been working here for the last 4 years almost. First in an adjacent neighborhood and now here. They came up with the interesting idea. I mean, one of the questions was, how do you actually connect to people? They came up with the idea of offering people a a small plant of a tree, a small plant of a tree, in exchange for their story. And the story would then, artists went literally to visit people at home, offered them this small plant, and said, ask questions, immediately gives all kinds of ideas about asking questions, like what makes you grow, what makes you grow in your life. And from that dialogue, a story emerges, which then is being transformed into a performance, which is then performed to the people in the neighborhood, in the park during a festive sort of festival. This happened in June last year. Just to give you an example, a short insight into this.
Mijn thuishaven is Oporto, de grote stad aan de Atlantische Oceaan. Daar geurt het net als hier. Dat vond ik eigenlijk het meest geweldig, om hier in Haarlem te komen. En plotseling toch soms die zee te kunnen ruiken. Ook al heb ik in 3 landen gewoond, ik besta alleen uit Portugal. In mij proef ik bacalhau met goede olijfolie en zwarte pepers. Caldo verde, sardinas met mais volkorenbrood, pino d'oro, rode port, aguardiente en pastéis de Belém. Proeft u het ook?
Ik heb mijn verhaal als toneelstukje gezien. En ik vond het heel prachtig, heel mooi in scène gezet. En beter kon ik bijna het niet zelf vertellen.
So, an incredible array of practices all over the world, ranging from what I sometimes call softcore or concept-driven, on the one hand, to hardcore or participant-driven, and many places in between. Many modulations in between. So it's a very diverse and very complicated spectrum that we are talking about here today. And at the same time, I also want to mention a few, let's say, more critical things about it, because it's important to tell each other success stories, hallelujah stories about this kind of work, but it's also important, I think, to keep thinking critically about it. And if you relate this quotation by one of the leading scholars in our field, an American woman named Jan Cohen-Cruz, to the picture I just showed you from the hardcore to the softcore. She says, I think, a very important thing. She says, I long to see the end of assumptions not only that community art is necessarily high on the useful end as a tool of the spectrum, but also that usefulness is in inverse proportion to aesthetics. That is, that high on the one scale means low on the other. Interesting thought, because a lot of people still tend to think that. What distinguishes community art, or engaged art as she calls it, from the mainstream is not lack of technique, which many performances that fit engaged criteria display in abundance. So there's a lot of technique. But rather the artist's actively committed relationship to the people most affected by their subject matter. And I think that sort of like focuses the work that we do a little more sharply. I have to run along because time is breathing in my neck. I said there's literally all over the world many people like you doing this work and thinking about it. All the way from Asia, where we have connections with this wonderful group in the Philippines called the Philippines Educational Theatre Association, but also many groups in India, like Jana Sanskriti, which is the largest theatre of the oppressed organization in the world, with thousands of participants, to La Red de Arte para la Transformación Social in Latin America. As many of you all know, I heard yesterday people here that have connections with our colleagues in all over Latin America. And then we're also beginning to find colleagues, partners all over Europe. And I think this is an interesting one that perhaps we can discuss this afternoon a little bit further, because I think there's interesting possibilities of collaborating across borders at the European level. We, at our festival in Rotterdam, have begun to work together with a similar festival in Bristol, England, and colleagues in Poland and Germany. And I know of a few other European collaborations that are beginning to happen. And so, once every 3 years, we bring together at our festival in the Netherlands, the International Community Arts Festival, what we consider to be exciting, inspiring, or otherwise intriguing artists, sometimes with complete productions, sometimes with just themselves, to our festival. The idea is that we look at each other's work. Sometimes we engage in each other's workshops. And throughout the festival, there is a dialogue between practitioners. And we have found a great need for this kind of international professional encounters, these kinds of international encounters, to talk about the work, to do exactly what we're doing here, but then perhaps at an international level. Because doing so internationally also makes your perspective, your frame of reference shift. So just to give you a quick clip of this.
We use theatre perhaps sometimes as a place to get away from the everyday trials of the ups and downs of life, really, and the challenges of life.
The key thing for me about the power of community arts is about the participant leading.
I'd like to broaden the question about whether art or community arts could be, should be, can be a tool or primarily an art form, but I'm starting to wonder about, is it a right?
I would say reaching an audience that normally doesn't get a chance to experience this kind of work.
It's making people to be aware of their heritage, their culture, and to be aware of art itself.
This is a rather mild version of at some points the discussion really got very heated, so don't get the wrong impression. After the festival, we also asked many of the artists to write essays for us, and we recently published this book. I have a few extra copies with me for those of you who read English and are interested in it, so come see me afterwards. I want to leave this copy for Eva and your new course. How much time do I have left? Because I'm not completely sure what time I started. Yes? Okay. I should be able to handle this. One of the artists who also came to our festival is a woman from Argentina. I just briefly want to basically show you an excerpt. She also contributed, I think, a very wonderful essay about the genesis, really, of the Teatro Comunitario, or the Teatro de Vecinos, in Argentina. And I think she also points, I think, or formulates, I think, an interesting argument about the necessity, the justification for the work that we do, that I just briefly want to share with you. It has to do, and obviously her frame of reference is Argentina after the dictatorship, and the important role that community theater played in her country. And I think she mentions, among other things, arguments like this. A primary task of art is to dignify the human condition by actively involving everyone, stimulating qualities like helping one another, stimulating the imagination, and thus to take a fresh look at reality. Art, she says in her article, is a construction, an artificial construction that evokes the real world but is not the same as the real world. It allows us at a short distance to take a look at it and to also imagine, through the power of imagination that is being activated by this kind of work, to imagine other realities. Rather than, particularly under dictatorships, this makes sense, rather than being forced to believe, being indoctrinated to believe that this reality that we live in is the only one possible. And I think that that's a very powerful statement. So, art, many believe, is a source of empowerment. But I think it's also useful, and here I'm going to shift the discussion just a little bit, hopefully to make it a little sharper as well. It's useful not to be naive about such assumptions. Artists, when entering into collaboration with communities, need to take in the bigger picture as well. And the bigger picture includes the realization that a community is not a fixed, homogeneous entity, but at best a loose alliance of people temporarily held together by the duration of an arts project. It's a slippery, very complex concept. One of the people, I think, that has made a very important contribution to our thinking about art and community, art in public space, is this Korean-American scholar named Mi-won Kwon that you should take a look at. And I think it's important also to perhaps start translating some of these international sources into Spanish or Catalan, so they can also, these ideas can also start reverberating and circulating here as well. I don't have enough time to get into it, but one of the things I think that Kwon really importantly points out is the importance to being aware of the power relations that you enter in when you do this kind of work. On the one hand, being commissioned perhaps by a local commissioner or a housing corporation, a prison warden, and on the other hand, your relation with the people that you work with. Very often, artists doing this kind of work tend to be caught between a rock and a hard place, stuck in the middle. So, the bigger picture that I think is important to keep in mind when we do this work also involves, I think, thinking much more deeply and critically about terms that we use too often, too loosely. Terms like representation, terms like community, terms like participation. And I think this figure, Majid Ranama, has also done, I think, important work about sharpening our thinking about participation. Because he says, basically, this is a dilemma that I'd like to leave you with for later as well. His dilemma, or the dilemma that he formulates, is the following. How can we reconcile, he says, on the one hand, that no form of participation can ever be meaningful and liberating unless the participating individuals act as free and unbiased human beings. And two, on the other hand, that all societies we know have developed commonly accepted creeds, religions, ideologies, traditions, which in turn condition inwardly unfree and biased people. There's a dilemma there. Nothing is neutral. No one is unbiased. Neither you, neither am I. And I think that that's an important sort of realization that bears thinking about further. I don't have time to go into this example because I'm running out of time, but I wanted to talk to you about this example, which I think is very illustrative of the ethical dilemmas, ethical pitfalls that exist in this work. It's an example of an English applied theater practitioner, James Thompson, who's also a professor at Manchester University, who went to Sri Lanka to work in a camp for Tamil child soldiers in Sri Lanka. The camp is called Bindununu Wawa. He did a project there which he thought was fine. It was very successful. They ended up with a beautiful show inside the camp. He went back 2 weeks later to England to discover that 14 of the kids that he had been working with had been massacred, killed by the people from surrounding villages. He went back to analyze it, and that basically helped him understand that before entering a context, we should be very, 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 very aware of the macro conditions in which we enter. What are the macro or even the geopolitical elements at play here? What are the hidden agendas? You cannot afford to just enter these kinds of situations naively. And I'm sure it's the kind of thing that at the Central School of Speech of Drama, when they take students to South African townships, or some of the colleagues yesterday who spoke about going to Senegal, you encounter situations that as an outsider, no matter how well informed you are, may get you into serious trouble if you don't do your homework. So, moving right along. I think wherever we do this kind of work, although the risks are perhaps not as lethal as James Thompson encountered in Sri Lanka, wherever we do this kind of work, in prisons, in neighborhoods, here in Barcelona or wherever, situations that are comparable to this occur. And it's important to investigate them carefully. I'm going to jump through this one and move on to my last point. Right? Okay, all right. It's important, therefore, to be aware of the macro conditions and not only focus on the micro success of your, let's say, of your work inside a rehearsal space. Because if you don't, and also not to overestimate, I think, the effect of the work that we do. Because if you work, for instance, with abused women in a workshop situation or even in a prison, the point was already made earlier this morning. There is an English scholar named Jenny Hughes, whom you probably know very well, also teaches at Manchester University, who makes the point that the correlation between participation in the arts and reduced recidivity, if that's a term, yeah, is much lower than the correlation between economic and social factors and instances of offending. And I think that's important also to keep in mind whenever we do this work. You know, it's at the very best a small transformation that you can bring about. But if the prisoner or the abused woman you have worked with goes back to the original context, you may sometimes end up doing more damage than not. One way out of this situation is, for instance, involving the abusive spouse, involving prison guards, as I know some examples, some projects have done, involving local politicians or officials of housing corporations in the work that we do. That's one option. I think another option, an option also mentioned by James Thompson, is actually taking the most powerful material onto bigger stages. And I think that's why I was invited here to talk about, that's the bigger stages. If I had time, I could show you some stunning examples from Northern Ireland and from Australia. I'm showing you a picture of here. This company also came to our festival last time. It's a fabulous company called Big Heart. They have created a community theatre production with members of a community in the Central Desert in Australia, Aboriginal community, and ended up creating a sophisticated touring production that went to all the important venues in Australia. And Trevor Jameson, the Aboriginal performer whom you see here featured on the right, in 2010 became the first Aboriginal actor to actually earn a nationally respected theatre award, the Sydney Theatre Award. So that too can happen. And now on to my final famous last words. Yeah? They're about maybe 50. I have to read them. Otherwise, I cannot say it so beautifully off the top of my head. All right. So, famous last words. To keep this exciting, relevant, cutting-edge arts practice only restricted to marginal neighborhoods, even if it does manage to bring together the super diverse people whom I showed you and talked about earlier, who live there, will only serve to confirm prejudices about it being a minor or failed art, and to further exclude it from the arts world and its audiences, plural. But if you take this art out of the neighborhood, or commodify it into the next exotic plaything, teeming with pure authenticity, there's a risk there. So you have to be careful about not turning it into an exotic plaything. If done carefully, sensitively, responsibly, sustainably, and all the other principles that those of us who do this kind of work apply on a daily basis, if you do all that, more than ever, these stories, these artistic expressions are capable of traveling across the rapidly increasing gaps that divide today's world, here in Barcelona, in my country, and everywhere else. Only then can they become part of the national conversation and the bigger picture, which we must continuously create together. Thank you very much. Algunas preguntas. Todos quieren ir al baño, ¿no? Dime.
Esto me pone casi más nerviosa, ¿sabes? Hablar en micro que no. Que creo que un poco lo que faltó ayer y lo que estás trayendo, y lo que creo que es necesario también, es poder construir estos marcos de referencia, porque muchas veces hablamos sobre trabajos, arte social, pero nos referimos a cosas diferentes, que están como bajo el paraguas de lo artístico y lo social, pero cada uno lo desarrolla de una manera diferente y cree en algo diferente. Tenemos diferentes objetivos o incluso diferentes backgrounds, miradas, y como nos mueven cosas diferentes también, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, se agradece este marco y es un poco una reflexión, ¿no? Y compartirla en lugar de solo con ella, pues con todos. El marco, ¿no? ¿A qué nos referimos cuando decimos trabajo social, ¿no?
Es un comentario, no pregunta.
Es un comentario, no una pregunta. Por eso lo dije antes. En lugar de decírselo a ella y quedárnoslo acá, pues igual es algo que faltó también ayer durante la tabla redonda, que no fue una tabla muy redonda, pero ¿no? Que cada uno iba diciendo cosas, pero claro, es muy diferente el trabajo que yo hago a una comunidad en Paraguay, no tiene nada que ver, ¿no? Entonces estamos hablando de algo social, pero en realidad es muy diferente.
Yo creo que también es importante, bueno, es difícil, ¿eh? Pero importante de hablar precisamente sobre lo que estamos hablando, ¿no? Porque no solo hay un... ¿Qué es la palabra en español? Frame of reference, cuadro de referencia, marco de referencia, que es distinto para cada uno, para ti, para mí, para todos, ¿no? Pero también de modelos, de técnicas, en este espectro. Yo creo que somos familia en este espectro, eso es claro. Y bueno, lo que para mí determina que somos familia es la razón por la cual lo haremos. Es que un término que me gusta también es que es arte dialógica, arte dialógico, ¿no? que está a base de una relación muy fuerte entre un artista y, si lo puedo decir así, non artista. Eso es también algo fundamental en este trabajo. Pero, bueno, con todos estos principios o marcas de identificación, hay mucha diferencia. Y eso me fascina también de aprender, bueno, qué diferencias hay. Y también, por ejemplo, hay diferencias entre teatro y arte visual, que causa, lo hemos notado, ¿no? Documentando el trabajo, comparando un artista visual trabajando en un barrio con un director de teatro que está trabajando con teatro comunitario. Son dinámicas muy diferentes. Arte visual tiene otros límites que teatro. Esas cosas también son cosas interesantes. Yo creo que es importante, y no he hablado mucho sobre esto, y ustedes van a hablar esta tarde sobre cómo formar esas artistas. Que en Holanda, bueno, tal vez es interesante contar un poco sobre esto, porque en Holanda no tenemos un instituto de teatro como esto, ¿no? Pero hay colegios de arte donde se forman artes profesionales. Y ellos aprenden técnicas. Y luego hay algunos, y cada día más y más, que quieren trabajar en los barrios, pero no tienen cómo hacerlo, no aprenden cómo hacerlo. Entonces, hace 6 años hemos comenzado en mi ciudad, porque faltaba esto, y artistas jóvenes frustrados no sabiendo qué hacer, hemos organizado, formado lo que llamamos un laboratorio de arte comunitario, en lo cual trabajo yo y un par de colegas, y somos más que nada, somos como en inglés se dice first aid for community arts accidents.
Somos los primeros auxilios para el arte comunitario.
24-hour telephone service, you know?
Un servicio de atención 24 horas del día.
Continue in English.
Mejor que cambie el inglés, tal vez.
Crear estructuras para apoyar a las artistas que están trabajando. Y no solo esto, también documentar, y insisto en esto, documentar, pero de manera profesional, para que se pueda entonces hablar más precisamente sobre las cosas, como yo he tratado de hacer. Entonces, es mi cosa, ¿no? Documentar lo más profesional posible. Ahora hay una colección de documentales que son fascinantes, que también pueden convencer, más que es otra cosa, más que estadísticas sociales, lo que es el trabajo, lo que es el poder del trabajo. Bueno, es mi pasión, ¿no? Yo tengo un poco de crítica. Yo sé que es útil y necesario trabajar con las ciencias sociales. Es muy importante poder medir lo que pasa con las personas con las cuales trabajamos. Pero esto no es la historia total, es solamente parte de la historia. Y hay que coleccionar muchas historias y muchas maneras de contar esta historia para poder también convencer a los políticos, por ejemplo, que deciden, por ejemplo, sobre un curso nuevo como la suya. ¿Verdad?
A mí
El señor compañero
hola,
antropólogo.
aquí.
Sí, okay.
Hola, me pareció muy interesante también de los peligros que pueden causar ciertas acciones o quizás no plantearse adecuadamente, no siendo consciente del lugar donde vas. Yo hace unos años me ofrecieron organizar un proyecto en Sarajevo, cuando Sarajevo estaba tomada.
En Bosnia.
Exacto, en Bosnia. Y llevé 150 payasos de España y de Francia. Ahí comprendí algo muy importante, que creo que solidaridad no es lo que tú deseas dar, sino lo que al otro le hace falta. Y hay una gran diferencia entre lo que tú tienes necesidad de dar y lo que el otro necesita como prioritario. Y a veces en este afán de dar no medimos que realmente qué es lo necesario al otro y en qué lo estamos transformando. O ideas muy simples, voy mucho a hacer mis proyectos a Madagascar, a Tanzania, a Eritrea, y utilizo, porque aprendí magia. Y la magia no es divertida como puede ser aquí. La magia es peligrosa, es brujería. Si no junto la magia con el payaso, el mensaje puede ser muy diferente. A veces hay proyectos que van y terminan más bien dañando que ayudando. Y ese aspecto que has planteado me parece muy interesante y habría que reflexionar, ¿no?
Gracias. Me hace pensar a una nueva disciplina, arte comunitario comparativo.